But what happened is that in the late spring of 1964, as they were trying to wrap up the Warren Commission investigation, an assistant U.S. attorney, Martha Jo Stroud, in Dallas, sent the Warren Commission a letterhead letter and said, what about the bullet that hit the curb? And she included a photograph taken by a Dallas news photographer of this bullet mark on the curb. Oops, now they got a letter from the assistant U.S. attorney. They can't very well ignore that. So they asked the FBI to check this out. They sent a man down to Dallas. He came back and said, well, you know, I looked all around. I couldn't find any mark on the curb. You know, no, that didn't happen. And in a very rare showing of backbone, the Warren Commission says, well, wait a minute. We got a letter from a U.S. attorney, and we got a photograph from the Dallas News, you know, so the FBI sent another guy back down to Dallas, and this time, oh, that bullet mark, okay. This time they found it. And some of you older folks may remember there was big news stories about that, with them cutting out a section of the curb and carrying it up to Washington. And FBI lab, of course, studied it and said, yes, there's lead, yes, there's antimony. This was a strike by a bullet, either a whole bullet or at least a significant chunk. So now they got to account for that shot. So how'd they do that? Well, former Senator Arlen Specter, who was then a young attorney for the Warren Commission, came up with the single bullet theory. And initially they said the first shot pierced Kennedy's neck, didn't hit any bone, went right on and caused all the wounds to Connally, including shattering his fifth rib and shattering the wrist bone. And then the second shot missed and nicked Tague down near the underpass, and the third shot hit Kennedy in the head. That's what has become known as the single bullet theory, or more appropriately, the magic bullet theory. Because what we now know is, and I will show you this later, the shot to Kennedy, he was never shot through the neck. There was an entrance wound in the front of the neck, according to all of the medical people at Parkland. And then there was a wound in the back at the level of the third thoracic vertebra, which is below your shoulder blades. So we're expected to believe that a bullet coming from 60 feet in the air hit Kennedy in the middle of the back, didn't hit any bone, but somehow coursed upwards, came out his throat, somehow twisted midair, went back down and entered Connally near his right armpit, shattered his fifth rib, came out the nipple, or near the nipple in the right chest, somehow entered his right hand and shattered that wrist bone, and then ended up in his left thigh. Oh yeah, right. Now, here's the lie to the whole thing. This is Governor Connally's wrist x-ray, and you can see that it shattered that dense bone right here. You also see these bright spots of metal. There are more metal that was buried with Connally when he finally passed away than is missing from the bullet. They say this is the bullet that caused all those wounds, you know. It's ridiculous. And by the way, this little nick up here, that's where the FBI chipped off a piece. Spectrographic analysis, the full conclusions of which have never been made public. J. Edgar Hoover sent a letter to the Warren Commission, and he said, well, we studied the metallurgy of the bullet fragments with CE399, and they're similar. Well, excuse me, but that's like saying the woman is just a little bit pregnant. They're either identical or they're not. If they're not identical, then it's not the same bullet. Alteration of evidence. And this gets back again to what I was telling you about how the FBI got control over all the evidence early on. This is the official deposition of James C. Cadigan, who was a fingerprint expert for the FBI. It was taken in April 1964 by Warden Paul official reporters. This is an official document. We find over here that somebody's come in and scratched out a bunch. When they asked him, do you know why Exhibit 820 was not reprocessed or desilvered? He started talking, and somebody scratched it out and wrote delete, and then wrote, no, this is a latent fingerprint issue. And sure enough, in the Warren Commission, we find that he says why 820 was not reprocessed or desilvered, and Cadigan says, no, this is a latent fingerprint matter. Exactly what somebody had written in. Well, what were they covering up? Well, because what he actually said was, I could only speculate, and they said yes. He said it may be that there was a very large volume of evidence being examined at the time. Time was of the essence. And this material, I believe, has been returned to the Dallas Police Department, and it was merely an opinion of time. We had a very large volume. Oh, in other words, he's telling them that, yeah, all the evidence was up there with the FBI. Well, they didn't want you to know that. And so then you go find, oh, this is what he actually said. And then we go to Dallas Police Chief Curry, and he said, Fritz was arguing, he said, I need to get people to try to identify the gun. How can I do this if it's in Washington? And down here he says, well, just say, nobody would tell me exactly who it was that was insisting. Just say I got a call from Washington, and they wanted the evidence up there, insinuated it's someone in high authority. Well, he wouldn't say who it was, but I'll tell you the initials are Cliff Carter, Lyndon Johnson's right-hand man. So Johnson was pressuring the Dallas police to turn over all the evidence. And he said, so we finally agreed as a matter of trying to cooperate with them. And then up here he says, there was no agent of the Dallas police sent to Washington. And Curry said, not to my knowledge. He said, did that work out all right so far? Well, not exactly, because they were to give us pictures of everything that was brought to Washington. And Fritz tells me that some of those little items is very poor reproduction of some of the items on microfilm, and says, as far as I know, we've never received any of that evidence back. It is still in Washington, I guess. Perhaps the commission has it. And J. Lee Rankin, the senior counsel of the Warren Commission, says, yes, the commission is still working with it. Now, then on November the 27th, then the media announces that the FBI has been called into the case, and it becomes the official evidence. This is why there is so much confusion. This is why there's so much question and controversy over what was going on. Did Oswald do this? Did the Soviets do this? Did the CIA do this? No. This is a picture I took before they made it into the 6th floor. And you can see that's the floor. So the window was only about a foot off the floor, and it was only about half open. So you only had this little window of opportunity here. Plus you got two 2-inch pipes to the right-hand side of the window, making it very difficult to try to lean and fire down the street. And the reason you can't get to that window anymore, the 6th floor would not let Oliver Stone film from this window, and you can't get there because they've got it plexiglassed off. And the reason is because you can plainly see the first shot's hit right about where this overhead sign is now, and this tree intervenes in the line of sight. You can't get a line of sight into the middle of the street. And that tree has been trimmed back several times. It was trimmed back for a TV movie called The Trial of Lee Harvey Oswald. It was and it was cut back again for the Oliver Stone movie. So that tree is in pretty much the same configuration it was in 1963. And if you go and be real careful, step out into Elm Street when the light's red, get to the center lane, turn and look back up at that 6th floor window, you can't see it because the tree's in between. And it's a live oak, so it has leaves all the way in through the spring. It was in full leaf. You couldn't get a sight into the street from the 6th floor today, and you couldn't in 1963. Furthermore, you can see that the Warren Commission showed us these boxes stacked up and said, that's the sniper's nest. And yet the Dallas News took this photograph and said, no, that was the sniper nest. A fellow by the name of Studebaker, who was filming all this evidence for the Warren Commission, in his testimony admitted that as late as Monday after the assassination, he was still moving boxes around and taking pictures of them. So you can't count that as any evidence. That's fabrication of evidence. And again, back to what I said, the Warren Commission shows us this exhibit number 2003, 6.5 spent rounds found on the 6th floor of the Scuba Depository. 3, okay? They wanted 3 shots, 3 shell cases. There you go. Tied it right up. And bottom is just blank. And yet in the early 90s, when the Dallas police finally opened up their police files to the public, I ran over and got a copy of the original Dallas Police evidence sheet, and it looks the same except, oops, they only had 2 spent rounds. And down at the bottom it says paraffin test made on Oswald was positive on both hands, negative on the face. Okay, now the reality of that is, because I have a copy of this paraffin test report, what they did is, you know, about less than 2.5 hours after the shooting, they got Oswald down to the police station, and they put paraffin on his hands and paraffin on his cheek. And what that does is will show if you have traces of nitrates or gunpowder, okay? Now, if there's traces of nitrates, that's an indication you might have fired a gun, but it's not proof because you can pick up nitrates in any number of ways, particularly book ink, okay? And we know he's moving around book cartons, and it's got printed stuff on them, could have got it there. Urine will test positive for nitrates, but we won't get into his bathroom habits. But the key thing is that there was no gunpowder on his hands or his face. There was some slight nitrates on his hands, but none on his face. Now, this is evidence he had not fired a rifle that day, because those of you familiar with a rifle, you know that if you're going to get 3 shots off in 6 seconds, and it takes 2 seconds just to cock the bolt and pull the trigger on a bolt-action rifle, you don't have time to lower it and activate the bolt. You're going to hold it up like that, and you've got to go pow, pow, pow. Okay, when you pull that bolt back, you're going to get hit with gases full of nitrates and gunpowder, all right? Well, he had no gunpowder or nitrates on his face and only some nitrates on his hands. That actually tends to show that he was innocent of firing a rifle. And yet they could argue, and in fact they do, saying that the paraffin test was unreliable. Well, maybe so, but instead of explaining exactly how it was unreliable, the Warren Commission simply suppressed it, just eliminated that. So in other words, fabricating evidence and altering evidence, suppressing evidence. Every one of the medical people at Parkland Hospital said Kennedy had a gaping wound in the right rear portion of his head. And if you're trying to figure out how that worked, after a very, very long study, most of the credible researchers have figured out that when he was first hit, his hands come up towards his throat. He starts sagging to the left front, which puts him in a position that from the grassy knoll, a shot enters his right temple at the hairline and then blows out the right rear portion of his head. And yet when they started showing us these drawings supposedly made from the autopsy photographs, there's nothing missing in the right rear portion of his head, and this little, what appears to be a hole here. In fact, they said the wound, okay, drawing depicting the posterior head wound. And yet, some years later, when the actual autopsy photographs were made public, you find out that that wasn't a hole at all. In fact, Dr. Humes, the autopsy surgeon, said, well, I'm not sure what that is. It looks like it might be dried blood. And yes, it does, because you can see hair growing through it. And again, no gaping hole in the right rear portion of the head, but it looks like it's all been painted in dark here. The autopsy report says the second wound occurred at the posterior back at the level of the third thoracic vertebra, which is right here between your shoulder blades. And it's also depicted on the autopsy face sheet. This is the one that was published in the Warren Commission, and this is the actual face sheet, and you notice there's something missing over here. On the original one, it says verified George Berkeley, his personal physician. So they verified that that's where the bullet hole was, and yet they deleted Berkeley's signature so they could argue, well, this is just a loose drawing. It's not really, you know, precise. And you also notice that his brain was missing. And yet a week later, all of a sudden, they had a brain and it weighed so much, et cetera, et cetera. It is now missing. All right. The bullet hole in the jacket shows, again, in the lower back to the right of the backbone. And they've tried to argue, well, he was waving, and so when you wave, your coat rides up, and, you know, the bullet hole in the coat is not where it actually was. And yet we find that the same thing's in his shirt. And your shirt doesn't rise up just because you're waving. So again, they're lying to you about that. And then again, back to the drawings that they tried to show us. Now, instead of the wound being at the third thoracic vertebra or up in the neck, as they said it was, now it's over here kind of in the high shoulder. So there, you know, was there another bullet fired, or did they poke a hole, or, you know, what is this? It's all just totally fabricated. Now, for one thing, let's lay to rest this idea. I'm sure some of you have heard the idea that the driver turned and shot Kennedy. It didn't happen. And here's frame 314, and we can